I never made a study of her. That's what I want to be clear about before anything else, because people have a habit of hearing what happened at Halcyon and filling in details that weren't there. They imagine I must have known. They imagine I had some instinct, some animal sense for the shape of a thing too large to fit its container. They're wrong. I was a mechanic who fixed power couplings and comm arrays in a resettlement waystation above a gray moon, and she was a woman who ran a second-hand goods stall 2 corridors down from my depot. And for the better part of 2 years, neither one of us thought much about what the other one actually was. Her name, she told the registry office, was Sierra. No family tag, no home sector listed. She'd come in on the Karath resettlement convoy along with about 300 others from the outer reach territories when the Thivan succession collapsed and the Provisional Council started relocating everyone who'd been caught in the administrative vacuum. Halcyon Waystation wasn't a destination, technically. It was a junction, one of those low-orbit habitats that got built for a specific transit function and then never got torn down because people kept finding reasons to stay. It had a communal hall, a row of small commercial allotments, a registry and processing office, a medical station, and about 900 permanent residents spread across 6 residential corridors, plus a rotating population of 200 to 300 transients at any given time. It was the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions because most people were carrying something they'd rather not explain, and that suited most people fine. I'd come to Halcyon 8 years before she did. I'd done a long stint on orbital salvage crews, the kind of work that pays well and ages you faster than it should. And when my knees started having opinions about zero-G rotations and my right shoulder stopped cooperating with the torque of a full-pressure suit, I took a severance settlement, found a commercial allotment lease on Halcyon, and opened a repair depot. I fixed things, not glamorous things. Power cells, atmospheric scrubbers, comm arrays, pressure seal mechanisms, the kind of hardware that every habitat runs on and nobody thinks about until it fails. I had a workbench, a set of tools I'd accumulated over 20 years, a small inventory of parts, and a kettle that made a reasonable approximation of something hot. I had a view of the gray moon through the depot's one porthole, which was not a view that anybody would have called beautiful, but it was consistent, and consistency is underrated. That was my life, and it suited me. She set up her stall on what everybody called the secondary market row, a corridor of allotment spaces where people sold things. Second-hand equipment, fabric goods, foodstuffs, small handmade items. Her stall was spare. A folding table, a few shelves of curated objects she'd acquired from somewhere, and arranged with a care that was slightly out of place in a corridor where most people just heap things on a surface. I noticed the arrangement before I noticed her, if I'm honest. The way she organized things spoke of a habit of order that went deeper than commerce. Small items in front, larger ones behind. Everything clean. Everything, however simple, placed with intention. She was tall, not unusually so for a Thivan region alien. The people from those territories tend toward a narrow, long-limbed frame, but tall enough that she had to angle slightly when she stepped through the standard-issue corridor door frames. Warm amber-brown skin, a long braid of white-gold hair, almost luminous in the corridor lighting, pulled back and wound twice around itself in a way I later learned was a simplified version of a formal styling she'd been doing since childhood. Eyes the color of deep forest green, a shade that had nothing to do with any pigment spectrum I'd seen on a human face, a color that was simply more saturated than the usual range, the kind of green that made you blink and look again. She dressed plainly. A long-sleeved tunic in gray-brown, close-fitted work trousers, soft-soled boots with a structured toe. Nothing distinctive, nothing memorable if you didn't look at the way she held herself. That was the thing. That was what I noticed, slowly and without nomming it, over the weeks and months of passing her stall on my way to and from my depot, of nodding to her in the communal hall queue. She held herself the way you hold yourself when you've spent a very long time in rooms that required it, shoulders level, spine straight without being stiff, hands composed at her sides or folded in front of her, never fidgeting. It wasn't the posture of someone who'd been trained by a drill sergeant or a physical discipline. It was subtler than that, and older. It was the posture of someone who had stood in front of people who were watching, for long enough that she couldn't stop doing it even when there was nobody to watch. I'd seen it once before, in an old diplomat I'd done some contract work for in my salvage years. A woman who'd spent 30 years in galactic treaty negotiations and couldn't sit in a chair without looking like she was presiding over something. I didn't think about what it meant. It was just a thing I registered, the way you register the sound a machine makes that's slightly different from usual. You note it, you file it, you go back to what you were doing. The first time I spoke to her properly was about 3 months after she arrived. Her stall's power coupling had been throwing a low-grade fault signal for 2 weeks, the kind of thing that trips a microalert on the corridor's power management board, but doesn't get prioritized because it's not catastrophic. I'd been watching the fault code accumulate on the shared board because my depot occupied the adjacent allotment zone, and we were technically on the same power subloop. When it hit the threshold where it was going to start affecting my own connection, I walked over one morning before she opened, knocked on the frame of her stall's partition, and told her I could fix the coupling if she let me have 20 minutes with her access panel. She looked at me for a moment. Not a long moment, but a specific one, the kind of look that was measuring something I wasn't sure I had a category for. Then she said yes, and she stepped back to let me work, and she watched me work with the kind of quiet attention that most people don't bother to apply to a mechanic doing a routine fix. "How long has it been throwing the fault?" I asked, because conversation fills silence and silence was a little too pointed with her watching. 11 days, she said, precise. Not 11 days or so, not about a week and a half, 11 days. I found the issue in the second panel, a micro fracture in the seal around one of the junction nodes, probably from a pressure fluctuation during one of Halson's periodic station-wide adjustments. 30 minutes of work, which was 10 more than I'd quoted her, and I sealed it, tested it, and closed the panel back up. "It'll hold," I told her. "If it starts throwing a fault again inside 6 months, bring the code to me and I'll look at it for free. After 6 months, it's a new fault and it's a new visit." She said, "Thank you, Marin." She'd read my name off the depot plate without my telling her, which shouldn't have struck me as remarkable, and for some reason did. Then she asked me what I charged. I said there was no charge. It was a shared power loop issue, which was technically true and also not entirely the reason I hadn't charged her. She looked at me again with that same quality of attention. Then she said, "I have a contact in the incoming supply chain. There's a shipment of sealed power cell cartridges coming through next week, surplus, from a decommissioned station. Better quality than the standard allotment stock. I'll set 12 aside for your depot." I didn't argue. I recognized a transaction being completed on terms that were fair and that she had chosen, and I understood instinctively that arguing would have been the wrong thing to do. I said thank you, and she nodded once, and that was how we met. After that it became, not a friendship exactly, not at first, a mutual recognition that we occupied neighboring spaces and were both people who did things properly, which sounds like a small foundation but is actually considerable. I started leaving a cup of the hot approximation I made every morning on the corner of her stall's shelf on my way past, without announcement, before she opened. She started leaving a piece of whatever she'd made. She cooked, sometimes, on the small heater unit in her stall's back section, and the results were extraordinary in a quiet way, on a square of paper on my workbench when I was neck-deep in something and hadn't noticed the time. We ate meals together occasionally in the communal hall, sitting across a table from each other, talking about practical things. The station's maintenance schedule, a supply issue she'd heard about, a piece of equipment someone had brought me that was more interesting than usual. She was precise in conversation. She listened completely before she spoke. She had opinions, firm, considered ones, and she expressed them without hedging, without the kind of qualifying apology that a lot of people use when they're not sure of their ground. She was very sure of her ground. I liked her. I'm being plain about that because there's no point in pretending otherwise. I liked her in the way you like someone who you've identified as a person who has their weight, someone who doesn't require anything additional from you to be worth the time. I wasn't sentimental about it. I wasn't young enough to be sentimental, but I liked her. I liked her especially in the communal hall, which was where the waystation's informal social architecture was most visible, and where she navigated it with a consistency I found both remarkable and slightly puzzling. Halcyon's resident population had its strata. The long-term commercial tenants occupied a particular social register, the resettlement convoy arrivals another, the transients a third. There was nothing formalized about this arrangement. It operated through small signals, through who sat where and who acknowledged whom and whose presence registered as worth noting. She had arrived as a resettlement intake, which put her at the lower end of the informal hierarchy in the eyes of most people who bothered to have opinions about such things. She didn't operate as though this were true. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't performance. She simply behaved in every interaction as though the social strata were a clerical error she hadn't been informed of and wasn't inclined to honor. She sat where she chose. She spoke to whoever she was speaking to with the same measured courtesy. She didn't defer to the long-term tenants who expected deference, and she didn't condescend to the new arrivals who expected to be looked through. The cleaning crews, the maintenance workers, the intake processing volunteers, the child-minding cooperative that operated out of the residential C corridor. She had a moment for all of them, and she knew names. She remembered names the way she remembered facts, completely, accurately, without apparent effort. Most people found this slightly disorienting. A few found it offensive. One man, a long-term commercial tenant named Grev who ran a transit documentation brokerage and had opinions about social order that he expressed at moderate volume and regular intervals, spent about 3 months trying to find a register in which to place her that would explain why she moved through the corridor the way she did. He never found one. I watched him try. The incident I remember most clearly happened about 8 months after she arrived. Grev had taken issue with the placement of her stall. Technically, it was within the allotment boundaries, but it was organized in a way that he claimed impacted foot traffic to his brokerage, which was adjacent. His actual complaint, as best I could read it, was that she was more established in the corridor than he thought she should be for a resettlement intake, and that she didn't acknowledge this imbalance sufficiently when he spoke to her. He had escalated through 3 informal complaints to the corridor administrator before the administrator, who was a tired woman named Pelrath, who had been managing Halcyon's allotments for 11 years, and had no patience for disputes she considered administrative noise, sent him back with a ruling that the stall placement was within terms, and the matter was closed. He came to argue this with her directly one afternoon when the corridor had a reasonable number of witnesses. I heard the raised voice from my depot and came to the doorway, not intrusively, just available. He was not a physically imposing man, but he was standing close to her counter in the way people stand when they're trying to use their presence as an argument. He had a list of specific complaints: the foot traffic point, a claim about signage obscuring his display, a general submission that her manner of conducting business was not in keeping with the corridor's established practices. She let him finish, completely, without expression, without shifting her weight, without any of the small signals that people use to communicate impatience or discomfort. When he was done, she said, "I understand. Let me address those points." And then she did. One by one, with the specific clarity of someone who had been in a great many meetings where precision mattered. The foot traffic assessment was inaccurate. She had the corridor usage logs, which were public record, and the access pattern data showed no reduction in approach traffic to the adjacent allotments. The signage claim was unsubstantiated. Her display was within the allotment boundaries as specified in the lease terms, which she could show him if he wanted the document. The general claim about corridor practice was not a specific claim, and therefore had no specific response. But if he could identify the specific practice he felt was not being honored, she was happy to discuss it. Grev stood there for a moment. Then he said something that was shorter and less structured than his opening and went back to his brokerage. She watched him go. Then she looked at me, standing in my depot doorway. She raised one eyebrow, very slightly, a minimal expression, the equivalent of a shrug on a person who didn't shrug, and went back to arranging her shelves. I went back to my workbench. I was smiling, and I'm not sure I could have explained precisely why. There were things I noticed and didn't name. The way she handled high-stress situations with a composure so complete it sometimes read as coldness to people who didn't know her, and that I understood was something else entirely. The way she occasionally paused in a conversation, in a way that seemed to involve something internal that she then set aside before she continued. A brief, complete withdrawal and return, like a person translating from one internal language to another. The way she sometimes looked at the incoming transport arrivals, the weekly supply freighters, the resettlement transports, with an attention that was more than idle observation, as though she were reading something in their manifest that nobody else was looking for. I noticed. I didn't think about what it added up to. Or rather, I thought about it the way you think about a problem you filed as interesting but not urgent, occasionally, without pressure, noting each new piece of evidence and placing it in the general vicinity of the others without yet drawing a conclusion. One evening, about a year in, she told me something about where she'd come from. Not the specific something, she still wasn't ready for that, and I wasn't asking, but the shape of it. We were in the communal hall at the late seating, when most of the day shift residents had already cleared out and the tables were quieter. She'd been watching a group of new resettlement arrivals navigate the queue system, which was not intuitive if you didn't know the signage, and a couple of them were clearly lost in it. She got up without announcement and went and showed them. Not ostentatiously, just walked over, said something brief, demonstrated the sequence, answered 2 or 3 questions and came back. I said, "You've done that before." She said, "Yes." A pause. People navigating new systems. Systems that were designed by people who already understood them and forgot that not everyone does. She looked at her cup. I spent a great deal of time once trying to make a very old system more navigable. It's harder than it sounds. The people who built it have usually been inside it so long that they can no longer see the parts that don't work. I said, "Did it work, what you were trying to do?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Some of it, not enough of it. I ran out of time." She didn't elaborate. I didn't press. But it was one of the small pieces I filed in the general vicinity of the others, and it stayed there. 18 months in, I was beginning to draw a conclusion. I hadn't said anything because there was nothing to say, and because I had the sense that the conclusion she was ready to share with me would come at the time of her choosing, and that my role was to be available when it did. I was at my workbench about 18 months after she arrived when Halson's General Channel Alert announced the arrival of a registry audit team from the Galactic Administrative Council. This happened periodically. A team of officials would come through waystation habitats to update the resettlement register, process pending documentation, and run biometric verification on any residents whose records were flagged as incomplete. Halson had a significant number of incomplete records because a significant number of its residents had come through during the chaotic phase of the Thivan succession collapse, when the transit documentation system was overwhelmed, and a lot of people had been registered under expedient short-form identifiers rather than full registry entries. The audit was routine, the announcement said. All residents were required to present for biometric processing in the main processing corridor over the next 3 days. I finished what I was working on, logged my processing appointment for the following afternoon, and didn't think much more about it. The next morning she came to my depot before I'd opened. I heard the knock on the frame and found her standing outside, composed as she always was, white gold braid wound and pinned, green eyes steady. But there was something in her face that I hadn't seen before. Not fear. Something older than fear. The look of a person who has been standing at the edge of something inevitable for a long time and has finally arrived. "I need to talk to you," she said, and then she came in when I stepped aside, and she stood in the middle of my workbench space and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. "Are you all right?" I asked, which was a limited question, but it was the one I had. She said, "I have to tell you something before tomorrow, before the registry processing." She paused, that internal pause, the one I'd seen before. "I should have told you before this. I'm sorry that I didn't." I said nothing. I'd learned that the way to handle her pauses was to hold them rather than fill them. "My name is not Sierra," she said. "I have been using it because it was the name I could use. My real name is Sorry Thiven." She said it the way you say a word you haven't said aloud for a long time, with a slight formal weight to it, as though the name itself still had a shape that demanded acknowledgement. I knew the name Thiven. Anyone who'd followed the collapse of the Outer Reach succession would know it. The Thiven house had been the governing dynasty of a cluster of 14 settled systems for 300 years. When the succession collapsed, internal betrayal, an administrative void, a council that moved to formalize a new governance structure by formally declaring the last surviving heir deceased. The Thiven name had disappeared from the official record with unusual completeness. The kind of completeness that spoke of deliberate erasure rather than administrative accident. I looked at her. She met my eyes and waited. "How long?" I asked. "Here 2 years," she held my gaze. "From the collapse a little over 3. They listed you as dead." "Yes." "That was the council's doing." "Yes." I turned that over. I thought about the quality of her attention. I thought about the posture. I thought about the way she'd said 11 days precisely, when most people would have said about 2 weeks. I thought about the power cell cartridges she'd arranged as a transaction rather than accept a free repair, and about the way she spoke to the cleaning crew volunteers with the same precise courtesy she offered everyone, and about the fact that in 18 months I had never once seen her flustered by a difficult person or a difficult situation. Had seen her handle Grev's corridor complaint with the specific, unhurried competence of someone who had been managing difficult rooms since before I was working a salvage rig. I thought about the long braid she wore every day without exception, in a styling that was complex, even simplified. I thought about the way she'd looked at me that first morning, when I knocked on her stall frame to fix the power coupling, measuring something, filing a conclusion, then making a choice. "The biometric scan tomorrow," I said. "Yes," she said again. "It won't return Sierra. It can't. There is no scan that would return that name for me." I said, "What happens when it returns yours?" She said quietly, "I don't know. That depends on who is present and what they choose to do with the result." There was a long silence, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens when 2 people are standing in the same room with the same weight and neither one is pretending otherwise. "Were you going to leave before the scan?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I considered it. There are options. I could have been gone last night." She paused. "I didn't want to leave without telling you." I took that in. I didn't make a thing of it. I understood what she was telling me, not just the fact but the choice involved in it, what it had cost her to come here this morning when the other option had been available to her. I said, "I'll be there when you go in." She looked at me. Something moved in her face, in those green eyes, a particular kind of movement, the kind that happens when a person has been holding something for a long time, and something solid is suddenly offered as a place to set it down. She said, "You don't know what that might mean for you." I said, "I know what it means if I'm not there." She didn't answer, but the thing in her face didn't go away. The processing corridor ran along the outer edge of Halcyon's main hub section, a functional passage about 12 meters long, lined with temporary equipment consoles that the audit team had set up, ceiling panels throwing a flat, institutional light over everything. There were about 40 residents queued in groups, shuffling through in batches of 6. The audit team was a crew of 3 registry technicians and 2 officials in the dark blue field coats of the GAC Administrative Corps, carrying the particular manner of people who are doing a routine job and know it, and are not interested in it becoming anything other than routine. I arrived when she did. She had not come to my depot that morning. We hadn't spoken since the previous day, but she was standing at the corridor entrance when I walked up, and she turned when I appeared, and the look she gave me was brief and precise, and contained something I didn't try to analyze. We stood together in the queue. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say at that point. I asked her if she'd eaten and she said yes, which might have been true. I told her I'd fixed a particularly obstinate comm relay the previous evening, and she made a small sound of acknowledgement, which was more conversation than most people would have managed under the circumstances. She stood beside me with her spine level and her hands composed and her green eyes forward, and I stood beside her, and that was the arrangement. The batches moved through steadily. The scan process itself was quick. A biometric reader wand passed over the hand, a cross-reference against the registry database, a processing code returned. Most results came back in under 10 seconds. A name, a registry number, a status code. The technician logged it, handed back a processing confirmation slip, and called the next person. The 2 officials sat at a table at the far end reviewing flagged results, of which there were a handful, mostly documentation discrepancies, nothing that required more than a brief conversation to clarify. Our batch was 6 people. She was 3rd, I was 4th. The 3rd person in our batch stepped up to the scanner console. The technician passed the wand over her hand. The console ran its query. I watched the technician's face. The query usually resolved in under 10 seconds. At 12 seconds, the technician's expression changed, not dramatically, not a performance, just a small tightening around the eyes that spoke of something unexpected. At 15 seconds, a secondary processing indicator lit on the console. At 18 seconds, the console returned its result, and the technician read the display and went very still. The official at the table, whose attention had been on a document, looked up. He read his mirrored display. He also went still. The corridor was not quiet. There were people talking, a child somewhere behind us making noise, the ambient hum of the processing equipment. But a particular quality of attention moved through the space like a current, the way it does when something unusual happens in a confined area. Heads turned. The technician processing the batch ahead of us looked up from his console. The 2nd official stood. The name on the display I would learn later from the technician's official report, which became part of the record, read THYVEN SORAE succession designation. Primary heir active status. Declared deceased. Petition filed council record 7734 VAC. Biometric verification. Confirmed match succession record. Unvoided. Which meant that the council's declaration of deceased status had never properly cleared the biometric registry, which meant that, for 2 years, the last living Thyvan heir had been standing 12 meters from anyone willing to run a standard scan. The official stood. He said formally, "Would you identify yourself, please?" She said, without moving, without any change in her posture or her voice, "My name is Sari Thyvan. I am the last heir of the Thyvan succession. My status was falsely declared by an illegitimate council action approximately 3 years ago." A pause. "I believe you have my registry result." The corridor had gone entirely quiet. 40 people, residents, audit team members, the child who had been making noise, all still, all watching. The 2 officials exchanged a look. I saw Grev, 3 places back in the adjacent queue, staring at her with the expression of a man who was recalibrating several months of assumptions at speed. I took a step forward. It was not a dramatic step. I did not put myself between her and a weapon or a raised hand. There was nothing like that. I simply moved forward so that I was standing beside her rather than behind her, close enough that anyone looking at the two of us would understand we were standing together. I had no plan when I moved. I was not aware of deciding to move. I just did, the way you move toward a sound in the dark without a conscious instruction, because your body has already resolved the question your mind is still forming. I put myself into the shape of the moment, which is the only thing I knew how to do. The official looked at me, then he looked back at her. She looked at me. Just briefly, a glance sideways, the kind you give a person when you're checking to confirm that what you think is happening is actually happening. I met it. I didn't look away. She looked forward again at the official. He said carefully, "The GAC Administrative Protocol on Biometric Succession Identification requires us to flag this result for immediate escalation. This means—" She said, "I know what it means." Still level, still completely composed. "You will be required to report. A senior delegation will need to review the original council action. This will take some time, during which I expect I will need to remain at this station." A brief pause. "I have been at this station for 2 years. I'm not planning to leave." The official absorbed this. Then, with the air of a man adjusting to a conversation that was going differently from any prior version of this conversation he'd imagined, he said, "We'll need to place a formal hold on your residency status pending the delegation review." "Yes," she said. "And there will be this will attract attention, official attention." "Yes," she said again. And then, with a precision that was absolutely characteristic of her, "I suggest you begin the escalation report now, so that the hold can be formally logged before end of session. The administrative precedent on contested succession identifications allows a 48-hour window before the hold requires council-level authorization. You will want that documentation clean." The official looked at her for a moment in a way that I understood. The way you look at someone when you've been doing a job for a long time and have just realized that the person in front of you knows your job better than you do. He said, "Yes, of course." He looked at his colleague, something passed between them, then he looked at me. "Are you?" "He's with me," she said before I could open my mouth. Quietly, simply. The official nodded. He stepped back to his table and began the escalation report. The rest of the corridor slowly returned to something resembling its previous function. The technicians resumed processing. The queue moved. People spoke to each other in low voices and tried not to stare. My biometric scan came back when the technician got to me in under 8 seconds. VAUL-MAREN resident classification. Long-term commercial tenant status. Current, no surprises, no secondary indicators, nothing that warranted a second look. The technician handed me my processing slip with slightly more attention than he'd been giving the previous results. I folded it and put it in my pocket. We left the corridor together when the session finished. She didn't speak until we were clear of the main processing zone, in the junction passage that branched toward the commercial corridor and my depot. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said I was fourth in the batch. I was going to be standing there regardless. She glanced at me. I saw the corner of her mouth move just slightly, not a smile exactly, but the acknowledgement of one. I said, "How are you?" She was quiet for a moment. A real quiet, not the formal pauses, the kind that meant she was checking something that didn't have a quick answer. "Strange," she said finally. It has been a long time since anyone knew my real name. Even the word sorry, I haven't said it aloud in some time." Another pause, longer than I realized. I said, "Sorry." Just that, her name, said as a statement, the way you confirm something you've received. She stopped walking. I stopped with her. We were standing in the junction passage. a corridor junction with 3 branches running off in different directions, and a set of overhead lights that were slightly yellower than the ones in the processing zone. And she was looking at me with those green eyes, and something in her face that I'd never seen there before, something open. Something that hadn't been there when she was managing the audit official or composing herself in the processing queue. Something that was simply present, without management. She said quietly, "I chose to stay at this station. A year and a half ago, when I first understood that the administrative drift in the registry had given me an opening, I could have transferred. I could have moved further from the operational zones. I had options." She looked at me steadily. "I chose not to take them." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't think you do." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "I think I do, but go ahead." The corner of her mouth moved again. Then she said more quietly, "There was nothing left of what I was in any place that knew me. My court was gone. My house was voided. My name was filed as extinct. I had no reference anymore for who I was, except in the very oldest part of myself, which is the part that doesn't require external confirmation." She paused. "And then I set up a stall 2 corridors from a man who fixed my power coupling without charging me, who left a cup of something hot outside my stall every morning without announcement, and who spoke to me as though I were simply a person who was worth speaking to, without context, without knowing anything about what I was or what I had been." The green eyes held mine. "You have no idea what that is worth. You cannot have any idea." I had some idea. Not the full weight of it. I hadn't lived her version of it, but I had the shape of it. I knew what it meant to have a reference for yourself, and I knew what it was to lose one, and I knew what it was to have someone give you back something solid when you'd been operating without. I said, "You sat across from me in the communal hall for the better part of 2 years, and had opinions about the maintenance schedule." She looked at me. I said, "You were always just yourself as far as I could see. That's the part I was responding to. I don't know what a Thiven court looks like. I know what you look like when you've decided something is wrong and you're going to say so." She was quiet. The green eyes were very still. I said, "None of that changes because of what the scanner said." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, not a question, not a statement exactly, something between the two, "Marin. Just my name. The way you say a word that means something you don't have another word for." I said, "I'll be here for whatever comes next. The delegation, the review, all of it. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at me for what felt like a measured interval, but was probably only a few seconds. Something settled in her face, not relaxation, because she didn't relax exactly, but something that was the sorry equivalent of it. A completeness. A closing of an account that had been open for a long time. She said, "I know." And then she started walking, back toward the commercial corridor, and I walked beside her, and neither one of us needed to say anything else right then. The GAC delegation arrived 11 days later, precise as she had been. The escalation report had moved faster than I'd expected, which I learned later was because the biometric confirmation of a voided succession record was the kind of administrative anomaly that the GAC's senior offices didn't allow to sit in a queue. The delegation was 6 people, 2 senior registry officials, a legal review officer, and 3 members of what turned out to be a specially convened succession review panel. And they arrived at Halcyon aboard a designated administrative transport that was visibly more maintained than anything that usually docked at a waystation our size. She met them in the waystation's formal reception space, which was really just the larger of our 2 administrative meeting rooms, fitted out with whatever surfaces the waystation administration could arrange on short notice to suggest formality. She wore her gray-brown tunic, which had been cleaned and pressed to a finish that made it look considerably more intentional than a plain work garment. The white gold braid was arranged differently, more complex, more layered, with 2 additional winds and a structure at the back that I realized I was seeing for the first time, and that had the quality of something very old. Precise in a way that had nothing to do with the available mirror time, but was simply correct because she knew exactly how it was done. I was there because she'd asked me to be, in those words, "I would like you to be present," which I understood was not a small thing for her to say, and which I answered simply by being there. I'll be honest about those sessions. Most of the formal review was over my head. Legal language, succession codes, GAC administrative precedent going back 2 centuries. I understood maybe 60% of the specific claims being made at any given moment. What I understood completely was her. The way she engaged the review panel, with the same directness she brought to every conversation, the same precision, the complete absence of any apology for existing in the room. She corrected the legal review officer twice on the specifics of the succession code. The first time he looked at her with mild surprise and verified her correction and found it accurate. The second time he simply nodded and made the amendment without verifying, which told me something about how quickly he'd recalibrated. She knew this material the way she knew everything completely, without apparent effort from the inside out. She didn't have documents with her because she didn't need them. The succession code, the council's specific procedural failures, the sequence of administrative actions that had created the false declaration. She could cite it all from memory, with date stamps, because she had been living with this information for 3 years and had had considerable time to understand it. I sat against the wall at the back of the room and watched her work, and understood, for the first time with full clarity, what it actually meant that she had been running a second-hand goods stall in a transit corridor above a gray moon. The formal review took 2 days of sessions. I was not in most of them, but she came to my depot every evening when they were done, and we sat her on the spare stool I'd set out on the second day because the first day she'd been standing and I'd noticed her not noticing she was tired, and she told me what the day had covered, not in detail, mostly in outline. The falsification of the succession dissolution, the illegitimacy of the council action, the biometric record that had sat dormant in the GAC registry for 3 years, unvoided, because the council had filed the declaration of death without properly clearing the underlying biological record, which was an administrative failure that now constituted evidence of the declaration's illegitimacy. On the first evening she was quieter than usual. She ate what she'd brought and answered my questions about the session in the precise outlines she'd given, but there was something underneath the precision that I recognized as tiredness of a different kind than physical. The kind that comes from spending a full day inside the wreckage of something that had mattered enormously, nomming the specific pieces of the damage out loud in formal language, for strangers to review and record. The kind of tired that a person gets from being required to be accurate about a grief that hasn't entirely finished. I didn't ask about it. I made a second cup of something hot and set it down without comment, and I went back to the comm relay I'd been working on, and she sat on the stool and watched me work for a while in a way that I understood wasn't about the relay. After some time she said simply, "Thank you." I said, "There's nothing to thank me for." She said, "There is," and left it there, and I left it there too. On the second evening she said, "It will be confirmed, the dissolution will be reversed, the succession record will be restored." She said it without triumph, without particular emotion, a fact. I said, "And then?" She considered, "The succession restoration gives me a formal status. Whether I choose to exercise what that status allows, governance claims, territorial recovery, the reconstruction of a functioning house, that is a different question, a much longer one." She looked at the workbench, at the half-dismantled comm relay I'd been working on. "I have thought about it a great deal in the last 2 years. When you have nothing left of what you were, you get a particular kind of clarity about what you actually want it to be, if it can be rebuilt." I said, "What do you want it to be?" She looked at me. The green eyes had that quality again, that openness, the unmanaged version. She said, "Something that resembles what I found here in certain respects. Something where people are spoken to as though they are simply people who are worth speaking to, without context, without requiring them to be more than they are. She paused. I had a court once that ran on a different principle, and I watched it destroy itself. I said, that's a good principle to rebuild from. She said, I thought so. We finished the meal she'd brought. She went back to her residential corridor. I went back to the comm relay. The corridor traffic had quieted for the evening outside, the usual shift to the lower ambient sounds of a waystation at night, the more distant murmur of the communal hall's late seating, the periodic tone of the atmospheric processors cycling. On the morning of the third day, the review panel issued its formal finding. The succession dissolution was declared illegitimate. Sorry Thiven's biometric status was formally restored. The false declaration of deceased status was flagged for administrative review and referral to the GAC's Oversight Commission. The senior registry official read the finding aloud in the administrative meeting room, in formal language that I followed at about 60% comprehension. And when it was done, the room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms get quiet when a significant thing has been said. She said, "Thank you." 2 words to the full delegation, in the particular voice she used when she was not performing gratitude but actually felt it level, with the faint formal weight that her real name had. Then she looked at me, across the room, and the look was brief and specific, and contained something that I recognized, and that I expect I will remember for as long as I'm able to remember anything. After the delegation left, she came back to the commercial corridor. She opened her stall. She arranged her shelves in the precise and careful way she always did. The corridor went about its day around her. A few residents made a point of coming past who wouldn't ordinarily have made that walk, looking at her with a slightly different quality of attention than they'd had 2 days before. She acknowledged them with the same measured courtesy she had always used, which was to say, she didn't treat them differently for looking at her differently, which I recognized as a thing that required considerable self-discipline. I opened my depot and went back to the comm relay. At noon, she appeared in my doorway with 2 portions of the things she sometimes made on her heater unit. Something with a spiced grain base, and a particular quality of warmth that I'd never been able to identify the source ingredient of, and had never asked, because I'd learned that some things are better received than analyzed. She set one down on my workbench. She took her usual position on the spare stool, which was no longer spare in any functional sense. She ate. I ate. The waystation ran its ambient hum around us. After a while she said, the delegation indicated there are processes to begin, formal petitions, recovery claims, contact with any remaining Thiven allied systems. She was quiet for a moment. It will require considerable time. Some of it I can conduct from here for a while. Some of it will require travel. She looked at me steadily. I have not yet determined the full shape of it. I said, all right. She said, I wanted to tell you that. I said, I know. She looked at me. That look again, the one with the particular quality, the one I didn't have a full name for. I said I meant what I said, in the corridor, I'm not going anywhere. She held my gaze. For a person who was composed about nearly everything, she had a very uncomplicated way of letting something show when she chose to. She said, I know that too. A pause. I wasn't certain at first. 2 years ago when I chose to stay, I couldn't have told you why I was certain it was the right choice. It was something I knew without evidence. I said, that's usually how the important things work. She said quietly, yes. We finished the meal. She went back to her stall. I went back to the comm relay. The corridor traffic moved past the way it always did. The usual mix of residents and transients and maintenance crews and the registry desk volunteers and the cleaning crew who had, I noticed, been stopping at her stall for longer than strictly necessary for weeks now, because she always had a moment for them and always spoke to them by name. I fixed the relay. It was a good fix, the kind that holds. I always liked those best, The repairs that you knew when you closed the panel would outlast your involvement with them. That evening she came to my depot again at the end of the day, as she had done with increasing regularity over the past weeks. She didn't have a stated reason. She sat on the stool and we talked about what the delegation had actually said versus what the formal language meant, and about a supply chain irregularity she'd noticed that affected 3 of the corridor stalls besides her own, and about a small piece of equipment a resident had brought to me that turned out to be considerably more interesting than it looked. At some point, the conversation ran down to a comfortable silence, the kind you can only have with a person who doesn't require you to fill it. She said eventually, "I have been thinking about the court I described, what I would build if I build something." I said, She said, "I would want certain things to be different, the shape of it, what it considers worth attending to." A pause. "I would want someone there who fixes things, who has the habit of noticing what needs fixing and doing it without announcement, who charges fair rates and arranges good transactions and speaks to everyone with the same weight." I looked at her across the workbench. She met my eyes. I said, "That sounds like a good thing to have." She said, "I thought so." There was a brief silence, the kind that sits between 2 people when something has been offered and received, and neither one needs to make it larger than it is. I said I'd need a proper workshop, not a salvage depot, something with the right equipment. She looked at me for a moment. Then, very quietly, the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was more than the acknowledgement of a smile this time, something warmer, something that had been waiting for an opening. She said, "I imagine that can be arranged." Neither of us said anything else for a while. The waystation ran its familiar sounds around us, the distant atmospheric processors, the soft, repetitive tone of the corridor access panels cycling through their nightly check, the faint vibration of the docking arms releasing the last scheduled transport. After a while she said softly, "You said my name." I said, "I know." She said, "That morning in the corridor after the scanner result, you said sorry, and it was the first time I had heard it from someone who knew what it meant in 3 years. She stopped, started again. "It is a strange thing to not hear your own name for that long." I said, "I imagine it is." She said, "I want to tell you something about that, about what it meant." She paused, composing something that was clearly not easy to compose for a person who composed things precisely. "When I was young, when there was still a court, when there was still everything that the court entailed, my name was said a great deal. By people who needed things, by people who were required to say it, by people for whom it was a protocol, a title, an address." She paused. "Very few of them said it the way you said it. As though it were simply a person, a name that belonged to someone they had chosen to acknowledge." I said nothing. I understood that what she was saying required to be said, and that the right response was to receive it without qualification. She said, "That is a more significant thing than you probably understand." I said, "I understand more than you might think." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Yes, I think you do." I held her gaze. I said, "Sorry." Again, just her name. Because it was the simplest true thing, and the simplest true things are usually the ones that matter. Something moved in her face, those deep green eyes, something that was very still and very certain, the way something is certain when it has been approaching for a long time and has finally arrived. She said quietly, "Marin." Not a question, not a statement. The same thing I had done, a name as acknowledgement as choice. The waystation ran its sounds around us. The overhead panels cycled their nightly yellow-warm shift. Outside the depot's single small porthole, the gray moon turned at its slow orbital distance, and above it the stars held their arrangement, indifferent and permanent. I said, "I'll be here in the morning." She said, "I know." She didn't leave for another hour. We didn't talk much. She looked at the comm relay I'd finished and asked 2 precise questions about the repair technique, which led to a conversation about the specific metallurgical properties of the junction seal material, which led to a tangential discussion of the supply chain irregularity she'd identified, which led to a silence that was simply the silence of two people at the end of a day, in the same room, not requiring anything further from it. When she did leave, she stood in the depot doorway for a moment before she went, the white gold braid luminous under the corridor lights, the green eyes finding mine. She said, "Good night, Marin." I said, "Good night, sorry." She went. I listened to her footsteps move down the corridor, even, unhurried level, the footsteps of someone who had been walking into uncertain rooms their whole life and had not yet stopped. I'd heard those footsteps for 2 years without knowing what they were carrying. I knew now, and the sound of them was exactly the same as it had always been, which was the whole point. I turned off my overhead lamp. I sat on my workbench stool for a while in the low residual light. I had not saved an empress. I had not done anything that required a title or an occasion. I had fixed a power coupling and left a cup of something hot on a shelf every morning and sat across a table from someone worth sitting across a table from. I had said her name once in a corridor when the room went still, and meant it, and not moved away. That was the sum of what I'd done. It doesn't sound like much. But I had been around long enough to know that the things that hold are usually the small ones. The fix that takes 30 minutes, the transaction completed on fair terms, the name said like it belongs to a person and not a record. The things that last are the things that don't require an occasion to be real. She knew that. I think she had always known it. I think that was part of what she had been looking for in the long years before she came to Halcyon, and part of what she had recognized slowly in the 2 years she had been here. I had recognized her too. Not the queen, I'd worked that out eventually in pieces from small accumulations of evidence, the way you diagnose a fault from its symptoms. But the person, long before the title. The person who said 11 days precisely when she meant 11 days. The person who arranged her shelves with intention and offered a fair transaction in return for a free repair. The person who sat in the communal hall and said what she thought without hedging and listened completely when you spoke. The person who took Grev's entire, prepared argument apart with the administrative precision of a woman who had been managing difficult rooms since before I was born, and then raised one eyebrow at me across the corridor as though to say, "Did you see that? And did it seem as unnecessary to you as it did to me?" That's who I had said yes to, that first morning when she came to my depot before the world knew her name again. That's who I had stepped forward for in the processing corridor, when 40 people went quiet and nobody moved. I hadn't made a study of her. I hadn't had to. Some things you recognize without evidence, usually the important ones. I turned off the residual panel, locked the depot, and walked back to my quarters through the corridor that was quiet now, everyone settled in for the night. Past her stall, with its shelves arranged in the precise and careful order that would be there waiting when she opened it in the morning. I said her name once more, quietly, to no one in particular, sorry, just to hold it, just to confirm what I knew. Then I went asleep, and in the morning I made something hot, and I left a cup of it on the corner of her shelf before she opened, the way I always had, and the day began the same way every good day had begun for the last 2 years.